G'day dear friends, let's draw and paint an Australian Willy Wagtail. I thought we should get back to some birds and use a whole lot of techniques we've been learning recently and the supplies as well. You know, they're one of my favourite little birds, dressed up in their black and white little dinner suits, and they sing delightfully, especially before dawn. We're using a whole bunch of techniques here today, angles and shapes and negative spaces, and just as a reminder, the negative space is the area around the subject or object that we're drawing, and it just helps make our brains think in a more abstract way and make sense of something. If you're busting to get painting, you can download the drawing. The link is in the description below, and the reference photo will be also. The first thing I can see is a big egg for the body, and I think another egg for the head. Now let's go to that very important shape between the head and the tail, that negative area in there, and it'll give us an immediate feel for the shape. Now see that little inflection at the back of the head where the nape starts? It's an ideal spot to pull a line across from there right to the tip of the beak. Now we can place the eye on top of that line and a little triangle for the top of the bill, and then extend the line under the bill for the throat. And just keep looking at how the shapes relate to each other, looking at the angle between the beak and the forehead. That cheek line is pretty nicely prominent and with a highlight in it just in there. And now the malar stripe, the white one, and the little border between the head and the body. I'm pulling a little guiding line from the eye 45 degrees out because I can see that the eyebrow is in that position. If you look closely, the bottom of the eyebrow is like a little zigzag or squashed M shape, and the top is like a smile. To help me with the breast line, I can see that that first point is in a line just a little bit to the left of under the eye, and then the higher point is just at the end of the beak. And now I can round it off. The wing is a bit of an elongated oval shape with a little tip at the end, but have a look as I come up the inner side of the wing. There'll be a point just around about now where I mark the spot where the dark shape angles off, and this also helps me with the shape of the belly. It's all about looking closely at these shapes and seeing what they mean to you. Something that looks like an oval to me might look like something else to you. I'm rounding off the body, but looking closely at how the lines relate to each other. It was easier for me to start at the breast and then go under the wing and join the two lines up. From under the wing, the body extends just there before the tail and forms part of the tail coverts, the feathers over the tail. I'm now looking to see how high the tail actually goes, and it seems to line up with a third of the way up the throat. Willy Wagtails are so fun to watch as they wag their tails continuously. So this particular little tail in here, I'm trying to get it kind of right, and anyway it needs a pivoting point inside the body there so that all the feathers will pivot from that point. I'm looking to see how far the back wing comes out and exactly where it goes. This also helps with the placement of his front leg. I can see that his other foot lines up with the area just beyond the eye. I can now see that his leg on my right should be lower, the bend in the ankle, so I need to fix that. I'm going to go over all the lines with a marker now, and while I'm doing that I'll speed it up and let you listen to the beautiful song of the Willy Wagtail. Now it's time to transfer the sketch to the watercolor paper, and I'm doing this by rubbing a 6B graphite pencil on the back of the drawing, and then I lay it on the window with my watercolor paper on top just to see how it all fits. I then mark my corners and I'm ready to trace. I'm tracing onto Baohong 300 GSM cold press paper with a 2B mechanical pencil. The tracing becomes the third time I make my way around the bird. First there was the pencil sketch, then the marker lines, then the tracing, and each time I'm checking the reference photo to see if I can improve on a line. And I take particular care on the last and fourth time, which is on the watercolor paper. We're nearly ready for painting, but let's just put in some masking fluid for those little white bits. When I use masking fluid, I'd like to put a little drop onto some scrap paper, and then with another piece of scrap paper, I use the tip of it to apply the masking fluid. I find it gives me all sorts of great results and keeps a fine point too. I'm adding it to the eyebrow, to the malar stripe, a dot in the eye highlight area, a few little dots on the top of the beak, and adjusting my paper applicator as needed. Next, I'm adding some masking fluid or a few little flicks from the breast area into the black area, and for best results I need to turn my paper sideways to make the flick easier. I really like those highlighted white little feathers underneath the belly, bordering on the shadow on the leg. When you're inspired by a photo or something that you see, it's really worthwhile taking special note of anything that's particularly nice so that you don't miss it in the end. And now, last but not least, I'm using the side of my little scrap of paper applicator with some masking fluid to highlight the legs with straight lines created by the paper. To start with our little Willy Wagtail, let's first put some brown into his eye. I'm using a little bit of burnt umber. We need to let it dry and come back to it. I'm now going to pre-wet our Willy Wagtail, all of him except for the belly. I'm keeping some of the belly dry and brushing some bits in from the outside like this. To me, papers are like cars. You drive one and then you drive another and you have to get used to it again. Arches papers wet really well. This is a Baohong paper and I just feel that the surface requires a little bit of extra water and then I need to let it settle in. Just a minute will do. I'm using a Rosemary & Co. Sable-blend brush series 401 size 8 and later on a Rosemary & Co. Kolinski Sable size 1 and Polina Bright rigger brush. When you look at the sheen on the Willy Wagtail, it could possibly be a bit of lavender. It's reflecting the sky, and there is also some reflected light on his lower body from the straw. So that's a little bit in the ochre area. So I've decided to use lavender and yellow ochre. The two of them also mix a lovely neutral grey. Because my paper is damp, I have to make sure that the paint I'm using isn't too wet, and I have to keep mixing until it's a creamy consistency. And then dabbing it over the head, chest and wing area. I like this dabbing effect because you end up leaving little white spaces that just look nice and fuzzy and create their own highlights. Then I'm adding some yellow ochre to the lavender to make it a little bit of a grey, a warm grey, and adding it as a shadow color to the bottom of the belly. It's reflecting the straw underneath that he's standing on. I've now gone back to the lavender and added a little bit of ochre to it just so that it's a bit more grey, and adding it to the tail, to the belly, the feet and the back wing. My paper is still damp, and now I'm mixing a mix of indigo, burnt umber to make a really dark colour, which can either be on the cool side with the indigo, or when I add more burnt sienna, can be a warm black type of colour. To keep the colour very thick, I only dip the very point of my brush into some water, just the tiniest little bit, just enough to loosen some paint. I'm finally ready to dab in some dark paint. No matter how carefully I draw something up, I still have trouble staying within the lines because my brush just goes where it wants to. But I guess that's the super fun part of painting. After washing and drying my brush, I can now blend the dark into the light. The paint is still shiny, so it's easy to blend out. For a bit of feathery texture, I'm using my brush on its side and sweeping up with dryish paint. With the paper still damp, it's a great time to look for all those little shadows or differences in light and dark. I'm moving on to the eye, and my main point here is to leave a brown highlight opposite the white highlight. When light hits the eye, it creates a little point of catch light, and then as it enters and passes through the eye, I highlight on the coloured side. A little more blending on the breast, and then it's time to mix a warmer black with the burnt umber and indigo blue for the wing and the tail. I'm dropping the paint in gently and then creating a bit of a crisscross pattern on the upper wing where the highlights are. After this, I wash my brush and tap out the excess water, and then tap gently over the crisscross pattern to diffuse it a bit. And then gently whisk some dark feathers into the white. What I'd like to do now is change the undertone of the tail feathers to a brownier one, like a black brown. So I'm mixing a warmer black with more burnt umber, laying it on the tail and then blotting away. I did this because the paper was still wet, and if I had put on a watery mix of brown or black or anything, it would have messed it all up. So by putting a thicker mixture on and then blotting it off, there are no problems. Let me know in the comments below if you're finding all of this useful, if things are starting to sink in. Let me know what you're having trouble with. I'd really like to know. And let's get on with it. Now it's time for everything to dry, and I'm pulling out my cement rubber. Have you seen one of these before? I used to have one in my drawer for years and years, and I had no idea what it was for until one day. Anyway, this is ideal for removing masking fluid. My little Willy Wagtail is all dry now, and all you need is a gentle rub. Then all you have to do is cut away the black bits on your rubber. I'm using a number 1 round brush now and going for those little details that caught my eye. All I need to do is pick up the smallest amount of water because I want my paint to be very dark. I really like how those ankles are highlighted, and so it's important to get this into the painting. I'm leaving at the tiniest little sliver of light on his right leg, between the leg and the wing. Notice also the little bit of shadow just above the highlight on his left leg. I'm going back to the eye now and changing the shape of the white highlight. He also has some prominent whiskers. And then notice how the bottom of the ear patch or cheek is darker. Now it's time to go back to the dried tail. I'm using some masking tape to make my job easier and cutting a piece and molding it around the body. This will help me paint the tail more freely and not have to worry about cutting in the edges there. I'm painting in the tail covert feathers, the ones that cover the tail, and it's so much easier with the masking tape there. And then suggesting some of the tertiary and secondary feathers. Just a few lines will do. I can then remove the masking tape. I don't even have to wait for it to dry because the paint isn't very wet anyway. I'm finally taping my paper to a board because I'm getting ready for the background. I'll be using the same colours I have for the painting, so there'll be some lavender, some yellow ochre, some burnt umber. Some of my paint wells have muddied up a bit, so I need to clean them. I'm mixing 3 wells of creamy paint. This is lavender from Daniel Smith and yellow ochre from Daniel Smith and burnt umber from Winsor & Newton. The reason for the creamy paint is that I'll be pre-wetting the whole of the background first. When I'm mixing paints like this, I like to use an older brush. It just prevents too much pigment getting caught inside the bristles of a nice sable brush. You can see the paint lodged in the bristles there. I try to remove it with a palette knife, otherwise it'll just get washed down the sink. To help me with water control and to make my life easy, I'm mixing plenty of paint. This will help with not having to remix paint when I'm in the middle of something. If you'd like to see my video on water control and how to make painting easy, see this video here. The link will also be in the description. The 4th colour on my palette is Indigo Blue by Daniel Smith. I like these 4 colours together. Now I'm wetting the paper all over around the Willy Wagtail. If I miss a few spots, it doesn't matter. It's a great idea to turn the paper at times to make painting easier. I now lay in some of my creamy paint onto the wet paper. Now I'm going to pick up my 2nd colour, yellow ochre, and lay it in the white spots between the lavender. That way the colours won't get muddy. I'm also laying it in front where the haystack is and not in the background because the background should be more distant. Standing on a stack of hay or something of that nature, and I'm going to put in some brown, just having a bit of fun here. And I'm also going to mix up some lavender and a bit of the ochre to make a grey, and I'm going to cover the bird so I don't get the splatter all over him. And I might put a little bit of yellow ochre, but now with only a little bit of lavender in the yellow ochre just to subdue it and put it in the background. I don't want it to be as intense as it is in the foreground. This is a Polina Bright rigger. I haven't used it yet. The paper is still very damp, so with my rigger brush I'm going to put in some fuzzy lines suggesting some straw. So it's a great time for some playing in different colours. And now even with some clean water I can make lighter marks. For my next technique I need to wait for this shiny paper to dry a bit. So now that it's a little bit less glossy, let's scratch in some dry grass, hay. And to make it better for the composition, to have a fair few of them pointing at the Willy Wagtail. And I'm going to run my palette knife along the top of some of these dark lines because they then get an instant shadow to them. I can also use the flat end of the palette knife to create some thicker shapes for interest. For the next part of the project, I'd like to create flowing lines behind the Willy Wagtail, those ones that are in the shade. So to do that, I know I don't have to, but I think it's easier to mask out the willy again with some masking tape. It's quite easy to mold. I'm now ready to play with some of that shadowed hay behind the Willy Wagtail. My paint's probably a little bit light, so when you do it, you could make it darker still, and it'll dry lighter anyway. I just love the freedom of brushing anywhere I like, so that's why I'm adding some more masking tape. I'm keeping in mind the shape of the sunny hay in the front and painting the dark shadow areas behind it. I'm now looking at some of the really dark shapes in the hay and painting those. And a little bit of scribbly fun is always great. And some thick squiggly lines with my number 1 brush, round brush, or you could use your rigger. I'm placing some shadows underneath some light lines, which makes the straw stand out. And then removing the masking tape. I've extended some of the straws into the background behind the willy. His feet have disappeared into the straw, so I'm going to find them again. And then we're going to do one last thing to highlight a few straws. I'm putting a little bit of white gouache on a scrap piece of paper, and with another piece of paper using the edge to scoop up the gouache and create nice little highlights in the straw. Couldn't be easier. And there we go. I think we can call it a day with our sweet little Willy Wagtail. We're doing all these things because every drawing or every bird requires something different, and you'll find the ways that suit you the most. So look, the more I show you or the more times we repeat it and look at it in different ways, just let it sink in slowly. You know, from little seeds, big things grow.